From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Peter Coy on some encouraging China data, Sonali Basak on the toll being taken on banks' headcount, and from London, Flavia Krauss-Jackson on the European Union starting to play some hardball with Prime Minister Johnson. So first, let's start with Peter Coy. We got some encouraging numbers, I guess, about industrial profits overnight from China.
That's right. October was a really bad month.
Yeah.
Now 9.9% year over year. But then December, the November numbers popped right back up 5.4% year over year, giving a good feeling about the outlook for going into 2020. We had less deflation at the factory gate. We had an increase in domestic demand. So that combined with some, Bloomberg does an index of leading indicators. Interesting composite of different stuff they pulled together that they find to be predictive. And that was had the biggest uptick, or really the first uptick in 8 months.
So maybe the Chinese economy is coming back. At the same time, also, there's a lot of bond defaults going on. And apparently the government wants to get their arms around that and make it, if anything, a little more transparent, a little easier. Right.
So the fact that there are more defaults is not by itself bad news, because they were suppressed before. You had a lot of zombie companies that were being, evergreened, kept alive artificially, and now companies are being allowed to default. The late Carnegie Mellon economist Alan Meltzer used to say that capitalism without failure is like religion without sin.
Well, exactly. And if you're going to have a healthy capital market, which certainly the Chinese want to have, you have to have a way of people defaulting. I mean, that's certainly true in New York. It's true in London.
Yes.
And maybe it will become true in Shanghai and Beijing.
So today, actually, the Chinese leadership, including the central bank and the securities regulator, came out with a concept, a plan for how to regularize defaults in China, so that things are done sort of by the book, instead of in an ad hoc kind of under the table sort of way.
So some encouraging news out of China, even in defaults. Thanks so much to Peter Coy from Bloomberg Businessweek. And now we want to turn to Wall Street reporter Sonali Basak. And talking about banks, Sonali, we've got some numbers now that Bloomberg's put together about how many jobs are being lost.
It's pretty staggering. It's about 80,000 worldwide, and 80% of that is in Europe. That's not too surprising. What is more surprising is the big, healthy U.S. banks, which are coming off a record year of profitability, also looking to cut as they expect times to get harder ahead.
Yeah, but in fairness, every time we go through an earnings season, one of the questions everybody asks is, how are you controlling costs? How are you controlling costs? They look at headcount, and son of a gun, it looks like they're controlling costs.
It's true. Come the middle of January, when they're reporting earnings again, people are going to want to see Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, the two that we know that are cutting jobs. Can they grow their revenue while they are cutting costs? Right now, if you look at Morgan Stanley's stock, it's the second worst performer among the top 5 big banks. And so really, if the revenue growth may slow into a tougher economic environment, which we don't really know yet what's going to happen, then they need to show profitability rising. And how do you do that? That's cutting the bottom line.
Well, but you put your finger on it. The challenge is not getting rid of costs. It's keeping your revenues up when you're cutting costs. That's the tricky part. Okay, Sonali Basak, thank you so much for joining us. And now we're going to go over to London, and we're going to talk with Flavia Krauss-Jackson about what's going on with the Brexit negotiations. We thought maybe everything was past us with this resounding victory of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but it turns like he's got somebody he's got to negotiate with over in Brussels, and they aren't quite so eager to get a deal done, Flavia.
Well, I mean, I don't know. He's having a jolly good time in the Caribbean. Yes, the EU Commission president seems to think that Brexit transition may not happen by the end of 2020. That sort of seems to be the received wisdom. Everyone thinks it's going to be extremely hard to pull off a trade deal in a year's time, given the precedents. I mean, these are very technical talks, and they usually take several years. I guess my sort of counterintuitive point would be, don't discount the possibility of making it happen given the political urgency. Johnson has every interest in making this happen. Macron, who's essentially leading the European Union, has every intention of having him out. Yes, these talks may get grinded, but let's not mistake that this is a very, very different game. If we think that this is going to be another painful, agonizing thing, we should be prepared for the fact that Johnson may be very willing to just pull the UK right out.
There's another variable in this, it strikes me, Flavia, and it depends on what kind of deal you want to have about the ongoing relationship. If it's going to be a minimal kind of deal, which in fact would be more closer to a no-deal Brexit, it's easier to do that than to really negotiate out each one of those painstaking deals.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, he's going to try and protect and ring-fence the financial community as much as he can. And also, he's going to start doing all sorts of side deals with the Americans. It doesn't need to be a big, massive, sweeping FTA. It can be lots of small little deals on key interest areas for both parties. So I think the political calculus going into this negotiation is going to be quite different. Beforehand, the European Union was very much driving the negotiation, setting and dictating and imposing the terms. That's not going to happen this time around. It's a different set of political circumstances.
It makes a big difference when the Prime Minister has some votes in his back pocket, which the prior Prime Minister didn't. Okay, many thanks now to Bloomberg's Flavia Kraus-Jackson coming to us on the telephone. And now it's time we get a check on the markets and how they're reacting to today's top stories. Abigail Doolittle is here with that. So maybe a little reaction, but not a lot.
Not a lot of reaction at all, David. Very small moves here for the major averages. And it seems to just be a continuation of the melt up, the cruise control right into the end of the year, perhaps, because we do have 2 days next week and a little more trading on the day. But again, just a banner year for stocks. One story on the day that could be interesting, though, is if the S&P 500 can gain just a little bit more, it will put the index on pace for its best year going all the way back to 1997. And if the NASDAQ can finish higher, it will be a 12th up day in a row for that tech-heavy index, the longest daily winning streak going back to 2009. So these bulls are out.
What about volume? We are in a holiday season, so how much do we have to take this all with a grain of salt?
Yeah, good point there, because yesterday below 50% below the 20-day average. Today, a little bit less, interestingly, down about 40% below the 20-day moving average, but nonetheless, not a lot of action. So the bulls kind of taking advantage of the fact that not a lot of players are in their seats.
But still, it does strike me people are not taking their money off the table, which you might think they'd be doing right about now.
Yeah, if I was up 30% on the year in a year that was, an earnings recession and on this wall of worry that investors have been climbing, I would probably want to take some chips off the table just to be prudent. But we're not really seeing much of that. The big tell could be that fourth quarter earnings season that starts next January, this coming January, just in a couple of weeks. The expectation is we're going to be out of the earnings recession, big growth. If that does not happen, that could be an impetus for some of these overbought and overextended conditions to come back down in some sort of either consolidation or maybe even a correction.
With 2 trading days left to go in the year. Okay, many thanks now to Abigail Doolittle for that update on the markets. We turn now to Mark Crumpton. He's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, at least a dozen people have died and nearly 50 others have been injured after a plane crash shortly after takeoff in southeastern Kazakhstan. Local authorities have grounded the rest of the budget carrier Bak Air's fleet. The aircraft was carrying 98 people, including 5 crew members. The Philippines has banned U.S. Senators Dick Durbin and Patrick Leahy from entering the country. The move comes after the two introduced a provision in the 2020 budget that would prevent Filipino officials involved in the incarceration of Senator Leila de Lima from entering the U.S. Manila also said it will impose visa restrictions on Americans entering the country if Washington pushes ahead with the sanctions. Russia says it's not willing to extend a UN-approved arms embargo on Iran. Earlier this year, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned that allowing renewed weapons sales to Iran will mean the country will be, quote, unleashed to create new global turmoil. The removal of the UN arms embargo within 5 years was part of the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. The U.S. withdrew from that pact last year. A massive storm system barreling its way across the United States is impacting post-holiday travelers from California to the Great Lakes. The storm roared ashore in Southern California on Christmas Day, unloading torrential rain in Los Angeles and even triggering a tornado warning near Santa Barbara. Storms will continue throughout the day in the Southwest, bringing heavy rain and mountain snow. This vigorous weather system will change northeast over the next 3 days. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Coming up, year-end market melt-up, and President Trump is taking stock. Get it? Taking stock. What does the strong market performance during the president's term mean for the chances of his re-election? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. So far, the equity markets aren't up as much today as they were yesterday, but the S&P 500 is still trading near all-time highs, and it's up nearly 30% so far this year. That's put more than $5 trillion into stockholders' pockets, and President Trump is taking some notice of that. Bloomberg chief Washington correspondent Kimon joins us now from the White House. So as I say, the president may be down at Mar-a-Lago, but he is paying some attention to what's going on in the markets, Kevin.
He's down at Mar-a-Lago while they're cutting the grass behind me here at the White House. But you're right, David. The president taking a political victory lap in the recent days as he has really come out to support the strong economy as well as the stock market. Take a look at one of the tweets. He says that the NASDAQ is up 72.2% since our great 2016 election victory. Dow up 55.8%. The best is yet to come. He also tweeted out 2019 holiday retail sales were up 3.4% from last year, the biggest number in U.S. history. Congratulations, America. This is a political battle, David, that the reelection campaign would like to have every single time. Meanwhile, Democrats, in contrast, are saying that the economy is only working well for those at the top.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, thanks so much to Kevin Cirilli, coming from the White House, where they are cutting the lawn in December. For more now on the president and his eventual opponent, will he be handling the political messaging around the economy and the market performance? We're going to welcome now our political panel from Austin, Texas, Matt Mackowiak. He is president of Potomac Strategy Group, and from Washington, Imani Cheers. She's Associate Professor of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. So welcome, both of you. So I want to start actually with you, Imani, if I could, because numbers don't lie. Those numbers we just heard from Kevin Cirilli are pretty compelling. What does any Democrat, who no matter who the candidate is, going up against President Trump in November, say about that?
I think you acknowledge exactly where we are. Hey, we're not here, and I say we as in the public, right, to focus on everything. We want to make sure that we look at a full balance of everything that is happening. And you're right, the economy is doing extremely well. And that's wonderful. And I give President Trump, as well as his cabinet administrators, the credit that they deserve for that fact. So I think you acknowledge it moving forward, but then you also, have the opportunity to focus on some things that are not so stellar.
What sort of things are those, Imani?
Everything from, unfortunately, our current failed immigration policies that we have. We look at the fact that we have officially pulled out of the, Paris Climate Accord and what that's doing as we move to 2020. You can look at the fact that currently, in our country, we're in the midst of a serious number of, trade battles, whether it be with NAFTA or we just kind of wrapped up some things with China, which definitely was a win for him. But at the moment, on the global stage, there is areas to be concerned.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Let's turn over to Matt now and get his response to this. Is that ground on which President Trump and his team would like to fight this battle? Things like the Paris Accord and things like trade disputes?
Well, I think the president's going to run on a strong economy in 2020, and generally incumbent presidents who have a strong economy are in very good shape to win re-election. Now, it is true, historically speaking, that President Trump's job approval numbers have been relatively weak, particularly compared to recent predecessors. But he was also able to win election in 2016 with low approval ratings in an election where both candidates had images that were upside down for the first time in American history. So, look, he's going to run on a strong economy, but it's not just about the stock market, although that's important. That's not just about wealthy people. That's about 401ks and retirement accounts. But it's also going to be about wages rising. I saw a statistic just a little bit ago that showed the bottom quarter of all Americans have had wages rising faster this year than the top quarter of all Americans. So Democrats want to often talk about, class warfare, but middle class and working class Americans are seeing their wages rise for the first time in 2 decades, and that's because of the policies and the tax cut, the regulatory rollback, all those issues. But to your question, David, trade and energy issues are going to play very well in the Midwest, which is going to decide the 2020 election. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. I would argue those are the only 3 battleground states in 2020. I assure you the Paris Climate Accord is not a winning issue in Milwaukee. As President Trump said when he pulled out, he's president of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
So Imani, do you agree with Matt that it really is probably going to come down to Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania? And if so, let's be frank, it was a very narrow victory for President Trump last time. It doesn't take a lot of people to change their votes. How would the Democrats change those votes they need to?
Well, I think it's a matter of looking at independents. to be honest. And a lot of times independents, like myself, tend to get left out of these larger conversations. I'd have to disagree with my colleague. We saw that that you had mentioned that people are not concerned about the Paris Climate Accord. I mean, that is something that implicates all of us today and then for generations, to come. We're talking about the rollbacks that this current EPA has done with everything from coal to the very strange comments that the president made about windmills earlier this week, and wind energy and renewable and energy that you just had to really question. Does he get and understand the peril that we are facing as a world, right? This is a world responsibility. But I do believe that we are going to have those battleground states that he mentioned are definitely going to be important. I don't think they're the only ones. I think what happened before in 2016 is where he said, hey, we're only going to focus on certain places and everyone else, do what you will. I don't think that's the case. We need to come together unified as a nation and really decide where we want to go. Okay, the fact of the matter is I don't believe that there's been this long-standing, hatred towards the current administration, but we've sat back and watched over 3 years just failed policy after failed policy. The economy's doing well, sure. Jobs and wages are growing, absolutely. Maryland, as of January 1st, is going to have a $15 minimum wage. That's fantastic.
Right.
I'm a Maryland resident. I think that's amazing. And we have a Republican governor. I just want to be clear about that. We want policies that work for all and just not for some.
Okay, we're talking with Matt Makowiak, who's in Austin, and Imani Cheers down in Washington. Matt, I want to come over to you and talk about the other side of the ticket, that is the Democrats that we've seen. And it's now almost the end of the year. Have the positions of those candidates changed very much? I mean, I think we went into the year with Joe Biden in front and Bernie Sanders in a strong number 2, Elizabeth Warren pretty strong. Have the positions really changed very much after almost a year now?
No, I think there's been pretty much solid stability among the top 4, perhaps top 5 candidates on the Democratic side. Look, there is no front runner right now. For a time, it looked like Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, might be the front runner, but her numbers have come down to earth, and her fundraising appears to have slowed in the fourth quarter. I think this is a wide open race, and because Democrats allocate delegates proportionally, which is different than Republicans, they do winner take all state by state, but in the Democratic side it's proportional. That means if unless someone really becomes a front runner in those early states and gets consensus and the party behind them, this thing is going to go on for a while, certainly till April, perhaps till May or June or even the convention. You basically have 4 first-tier candidates at this point, and you have the former mayor of New York City making an unprecedented effort to sweep up delegates on Super Tuesday after skipping the first 4 states, which has never been tried before. So, look, I think Biden's numbers have been steady and pretty stable all along. We'll see if he can survive Iowa, New Hampshire, get all the way to Nevada and South Carolina, where he's going to be stronger. But you have Buttigieg and Warren and Sanders, who are all fighting it out in both Iowa and New Hampshire. Perhaps one of those 3 is going to stand apart from the others and have a real lead going into the end of the early states and into Super Tuesday. But I think the Democratic race is very unpredictable right now, and there are significant ramifications. If it's a Biden or a Klobuchar or a Buttigieg, that's more of a mainstream Democrat. If it's Warren or Sanders, that is more of a full-scale progressive, and that's a different type of general election and a different platform depending on who the nominee is.
Imani, all of the things being equal, if there's a long race, as Matt says, maybe into May or June or even to the convention, does that almost necessarily weaken the Democratic candidate going up against Donald Trump in November?
Not with the top 4 that we have right now. I don't believe that that's going to weaken going in. I think we're going to really see what many people do want to see, which is who is going to be the best candidate to not only, yes, beat the incumbent, but also at the same time, who is going to look forward and unify our country? We are currently at division records that we haven't seen in almost half a century. We're at the point now where we have so many opposing just values and morals, right? It's not really necessarily politics, but values and morals and how you deal with immigration and how you deal with social justice issues such as police brutality, like having true conversations about inequality in this country. Yes, for some people, wages are rising, but at the same time, look at our homeless rates in the United States. We can talk about those here in Washington, D.C. alone, which are astronomical. So we're going to see people who can unify, come together, and who's going to really be the person that can move us forward.
Okay, many thanks now to our political panel of Imani Cheers in Washington and Matt Makowiak in Austin. And a quick reminder, Michael Bloomberg is the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News. Still ahead here, our stock of the hour, Rite Aid. It has climbed 115% since last week. What's fueling the rise? That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Our stock of the hour is Rite Aid. The shares are soaring after earnings set off a short squeeze, as they say. Abigail Doolittle is here with more. So it's up a lot.
It is up a lot. This is a fun one. Over the last, I think it is 7 days now, up about 185%. So to put that into perspective, early last week, this was an $8 stock. Now it's a $21 stock. Some folks really making out. But to the point around it being a short squeeze, there's a very high bearish short interest on it because this company, as we were just talking about it off air, really hasn't been keeping up with some of its competitors. So the bears have been out there wanting to push it down. And in the Bloomberg terminal, we can see what I'm talking about because the bearish short squeeze or the bearish interest close to 26% of the float. And so you have to think that this big spike up that we've been seeing more recently on a decent earnings report, they did put up better numbers, but it was super low bar. Investors really not expecting that much, causing this stock to absolutely soar.
If you're an investor as opposed to a trader, what do you see coming down the pike that might give you hope?
I think the thing that you would see coming down the pike is the fact, well, looking back, the new management team in August and looking forward, they are going to outline their new strategy in March at an investor day. But that's a great point, the difference between an investor and a trader. I don't think that you have so many investors in this stock quite yet. It's probably more traders taking advantage of the fact that it's not quite as bad as it had been, that there is some hope, that the loss was not quite as bad as it was expected to be, that the guidance was a little bit better, that we do have this new management team. But for the long-term investor, they probably want to see something much more structural. Of course, they did sell 2,000 stores to Walgreens. What are they going to do with the other 2 stores? Will they be able to grow their PBM business?
Yeah, and selling is one thing, buying is another thing. As you just suggested, some of their rivals have gone into things like health insurance. They've gone into PBMs or pharmacy benefit managers. And the question is, do they have to buy something or merge with something?
It would be very difficult. I think my first answer on that would be it'd be very difficult because the one problem this company has is a tremendous amount of debt. So they want to try to boost their profitability, but they are highly levered, which would probably make it pretty difficult from a capital structure standpoint for them to go out and buy something. They may have to do the best job that they possibly can with what they have right now, clean up the balance sheet, and then maybe that would give them the opportunity. But will they have enough time to do all of that? It's hard to say. And I would like to mention there was a reverse split earlier this year on an adjusted basis at the highs in 1999. This is a $1,000 stock. So it may be up right now, but it's $21, a fraction of that all-time high.
From Abigail Doolittle. Thank you so much on Rite Aid. Coming up next, President Trump has used national security as the means of levying tariffs. We talk with an expert about foreign export controls. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we turn now to Mark Crumpton.
David, more than 330 people were arrested in Hong Kong over the Christmas holiday. Black-clad protesters smashed store windows while police responded with tear gas. Authorities say those detained include children as young as 12. Nearly 7,000 people have been detained since the protests began more than 6 months ago. And Hong Kong is bracing for more disruption into the new year. One of the largest school districts in the United States has announced a new policy that will allow students one excused absence per school year to participate in civic activities such as protests. Students in 7th through 12th grades can use the day for civic engagement activities. The rule is the first of its kind in the U.S. After a landslide primary victory, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is looking ahead. He will need a big win in national elections in March to stay in office. And his best hope of escaping prosecution on corruption charges is to gain a majority in parliament that's willing to grant him immunity. The March vote will be the third in less than a year in Israel. Russia has confirmed it will appeal its 4-year Olympic ban for manipulating doping data. The Russian anti-doping agency sent a formal letter today disagreeing with the sanctions imposed by the World Anti-Doping Agency. The case now heads to an arbitration court. Russian teams are banned from a range of major sports competitions over the next 4 years, including next year's Olympics and the 2022 World Cup. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. President Trump has talked a lot about the economic effects of trade with countries like China. But he's also been concerned about the national security element, particularly when it comes to technology and intellectual property. For an update on how the Trump administration has changed things, we welcome now Nelson Dong. He's head of the National Security Group at Dorsey & Whitney out in Seattle. So, Nelson, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with the case that most people know about, and that's Huawei, because the president and his cabinet have talked about it quite a bit. Where does Huawei stand right now, and to what extent has President Trump and his administration changed the way we deal with a Huawei?
Well, in some ways, he hasn't changed it much at all. Even under previous administrations, there have been prosecutions of foreign companies, including Chinese companies, for export control violations. In this instance, there were allegations in an indictment filed in New York City and also in Seattle here. And those criminal cases are currently pending. That case in Seattle has also spawned the extradition request for the chief financial officer of Huawei, who is still under house arrest in Vancouver, BC. So the normal legal process has been running its course as it always does in such cases. The issue really has more to do from the business community with something called the entity list, and Huawei was placed on that entity list back in May, causing American companies who are its suppliers and who had previously supplied about $11 billion of goods and services to Huawei and its subsidiaries around the world, put them off limits. And so as a consequence, there has been a great deal of activity on the part of the business community going to Washington, trying to get relief from that entity list designation for Huawei and roughly 100 of its subsidiaries.
In your experience, is Huawei something of a special case, or are there other Huaweis out there either already on the list or likely to be put on the list?
Well, Huawei wasn't the first such company targeted from China. Several years ago, ZTE, another smaller Chinese telecom equipment company, was also targeted in the same way after documents were leaked from within the company showing that it had a concerted effort underway within the company to divert American technology to Iran, contrary to U.S. sanctions laws. And so Huawei was prosecuted in that case, ultimately settled out of court with a plea bargain and payment of a very, very large fine, appointment of a special monitor inside the company, changes at the board and officer level, and so on. So some analysts had been predicting that in the case of Huawei, a resolution of that case might at some point involve something of a similar scenario. At least from the viewpoint of the Justice Department, that would be an optimal outcome. Of course, Huawei has always denied these charges and believes they're trumped up in an effort to handicap Huawei as a competitor in the marketplace. And so the issue will be joined soon as the two cases proceed in court.
We're talking with Nelson Dong. He's head of the national security practice out at Dorsey & Whitney in Seattle. So, Nelson, let's change from export controls to investment, because we also have the so-called CFIUS, C-F-I-U-S, restrictions that the Treasury can place on investment in the United States. I understand that that has been toughened. There's been new legislation that's gone into effect in 2018. To what extent has investment inbound in the United States in certain companies, certain sectors really been changed by the Trump administration?
Well, depending on whose numbers you're reading, from a high in 2017 and 2018, Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States has probably dropped about 90%, which is quite precipitous, and has really been influenced both by capital controls inside China itself, but also by a much tougher regulatory regime on this side of the ocean. The United States now, through the legislation that you referred to, passed in 2018 by Congress, has added far more speed bumps, shall we say, to the process of foreign direct investment that touches what are viewed as national security or homeland security issues. So in the legislation that was passed in 2018, new powers were given to the administration to expand the range of controls. And so in addition to classical red flag signs, such as holding defense contracts or having very sensitive military capable technology. Now we're looking more at installations and facilities that may be within a finite geographic zone of military facilities. We're looking at things that are close to airports and seaports and the facilities like that. In addition, I think the real estate community is beginning to wake up now to realize that everything in the real estate market above single-family dwellings is now also liable to national security reviews if bought by someone in China, and especially if bought by a state-owned enterprise in China.
So, Nelson, finally, you said if bought by. Does it have to be 100%? Does it have to be majority-owned, or can it be even a minority interest?
That was another one of the changes added in 2018. The prior law had required that the investment transfer control, and that didn't mean majority control. That meant something north of 10% and somewhere in between 10 and 50%. But now even minority stakes and passive investments are still going to be at least subject to some initial review.
Okay, thank you so much, Nelson. Really appreciate you joining us today. That's Nelson Dong. He's a partner at Dorsey and Whitney out in Seattle, where he heads up the national security practice. Coming up, President Trump warns of Russia, Syria, and Iran killing thousands in northeast Syria. We talk with retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who's just returned from the region. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. President Trump warned yesterday of Syrian and Russian forces threatening thousands in northeast Syria. The Syrian civil war now has plagued many presidential administrations. Back in October, we sat down with former National Security Advisor and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice. And I asked her about the Obama administration policy towards Syria back when the war broke out in 2011.
At the end of the day, President Obama's judgment was, while we would help the rebels, while we would provide humanitarian assistance, while we do all the diplomacy we possibly could to try to end the conflict, we would not intervene militarily to topple Assad. He did make the decision to intervene to fight ISIS and other al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Syria. And that's the war that has been prosecuted primarily by the Kurdish forces that President Trump yesterday announced we were abandoning. The Kurds, for all these years, have been fighting our fight, the Western fight, as well as their fight to eliminate ISIS, and had done so with our backing rather successfully. And then President Trump said, in effect, we're abandoning you, we're leaving you to the wolves, being the Turks, who had every interest in killing them. They view the Kurds as terrorists. So we've gotten out of the way, gave the Turks the all clear to slaughter the people that made it possible for us to defeat ISIS. It's a terrible, terrible betrayal.
Did we defeat ISIS, or Islamic State as we call it here? Because one of the things that President Trump is saying, we don't need to keep our troops in there because we've won this war, we've beaten Islamic State, we can pull them out. Is he right?
Well, we've learned this lesson, unfortunately, David, the hard way. We had to withdraw from Iraq under the Obama administration. That was a deal that President Bush before us had cut, and we fulfilled. And then, what had been a form of al-Qaeda came back in the form of ISIS. And we also had to fight the same reformed ISIS in Syria. So the lesson there is that you have to keep pressure on the terrorists. It doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent U.S. military presence. And in fact, because President Obama decided to fight ISIS in Syria differently than we'd done in Afghanistan or Iraq before, by using partner forces, the Kurds, rather than putting U.S. forces in harm's way in the thick of the combat. We were able to do so relatively economically. So we're talking about hundreds of U.S. troops that remain in Syria, not tens of thousands. And we needed to stay both to support and protect the Kurds, but also to keep an eye on ISIS so they didn't get the sense that they could easily steal a jump on us.
That was part of my interview with former National Security Advisor Susan Rice. That was back in October, just after President Trump had announced that he was pulling U.S. forces out of northeast Syria. For more on the current situation in Syria, welcome now retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. General Kimmitt also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East. He joins us today from Washington. Welcome, General. It's good to have you back with us. Having looked at what President Trump said yesterday about the threat to what he said was thousands of people in Idlib province, is this some of the fruits of his decision to pull the U.S. troops out? Is he now reaping those?
No, I don't think this is related at all. This area of Syria around Idlib has always been an issue between the regime and some of the terrorist and opposition groups. It's quite far away from northeastern Syria, where this issue with ISIS and the Kurds came about. So it really is an apples and orange situation. What's happening in Idlib is a humanitarian disaster against opposition and al-Qaeda affiliates. And the brutality of the Russians and the Syrian forces is what we're addressing and was addressed by the president.
Now, the president said that actually Turkey is trying to prevent this, what he described as a potential death of thousands here. Is that right? What is Turkey doing in the area?
Well, what Turkey is doing more than anything else is trying to ensure that those Syrians inside of Idlib, if pushed out by the Syrian forces, don't end up in Turkey. As you know, Turkey is hosting almost 4 million Syrians now, and it certainly doesn't need a couple of million more that have been pushed out of Idlib into Turkey. So they've got somewhat of a realistic view of the situation on the ground. I wouldn't consider their desire to end the Idlib problem as necessarily humanitarian as much as it is economic and the pressure of those Syrian refugees inside of Turkey.
Is there anything the United States or others can or should do on the humanitarian front in Idlib?
Well, the sad part about it is the Russians have gone time after time in the UN Security Council to block the very resolutions that insisted upon humanitarian support into Idlib. The Russians are conducting a scorched earth starvation campaign in Idlib, not only preventing aid convoys from getting in there, but just bombing indiscriminately. It is a humanitarian disaster. There's very little the world can do, quite frankly, because the Russians are blocking every effort to solve this problem at the United Nations.
We're talking with retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt in Washington. So, General Kimmitt, is this part of a problem that we have not stood up to Putin enough to have any reason for him to back down? I mean, what leverage do we have on Putin right now in the Middle East? He's really entrenched himself in Syria.
Well, candidly, in the issue of Syria, this is going to happen with or without the Russian involvement. Frankly, this is the last major area that Bashar al-Assad needs to take back to resume and return entire sovereignty of the country to himself. It is the last pocket of resistance for both the opposition and about 25,000 al-Qaeda affiliates. So whether the Russians or the Iranians are helping Bashar al-Assad is going to end this fight, this civil war in Idlib, and he's going to use whatever brutality is necessary to do that.
So explain one of the things to me about this particularly, Mark. Everything seems to be connected to everything in the Middle East. We have a report on the Bloomberg today that actually Turkey is sending a navy to Tripoli because there are Syrian rebels who are now fighting over in Tripoli. Is that correct?
Well, that's true, but I think the real issue there is, again, against the Russians. The Russians backed the Haftar attempt at government in opposition to the UN government that was put inside of there. So this is another area for the Turks to fight the Russians by taking opposite sides. And in this case, they're on the right side by backing the UN forces and the UN government that's been imposed inside of Libya.
Is there anything we can do with respect to Russian influence in Syria at this point, or is it just a done deal as a practical matter?
Candidly, I think it's a done deal outside of diplomacy. Militarily, we're not prepared to do anything. Economically, we can't do anything more to Russia or to the Syrians that hasn't already been done. It would take a diplomatic breakthrough between the United States and Putin to actually have his forces pull back. But even if they pull back, even if the Syrian forces pull back, there are still 25,000 to 30,000 al-Qaeda affiliates inside of Idlib. And you've got to ask the question, what's going to happen to them? Will they just remain a cancer in the middle of Syria, or does more action need to be taken, just more selectively and not with military action that puts you quite close to war crimes?
Historically, Iran has been a supporter of President Assad in Syria. What is the relationship between Iran and Russia with respect to Syria?
They don't like each other there. They don't work together there. Iran doesn't necessarily want to uphold Bashar al-Assad's sovereignty over the Syrian state. They're more concerned about being in South Syria, aligned with the Iranian-backed Hezbollah that's inside of Beirut, and continue to put pressure in both cases against the Iranian arch enemy, which is the State of Israel.
Have the days of humanitarian intervention just gone by?
Certainly the way that the former administration sought the duty to protect, the need for humanitarian intervention, the Chapter 6 types of operations by the United Nations. There still are a significant number of those operations, peacekeeping operations, peace enforcement operations in Africa. But they certainly, these types of operations inside the Middle East, as you say, those are days gone by.
You mentioned Africa. There are reports, as you know, in the press that actually the United States is changing their military posture to pull out of Western Africa, particularly in support of some French forces there. Does that make sense?
You know, it really does. About the only thing that I agreed with Secretary Rice in the last segment was the notion of getting partner forces to do more work. It should not be the case that Americans need to be the first solution for every problem in the world. In the case of Africa, particularly with the French historical links to Africa, they're a much better force. It doesn't necessarily take the United States forces to do it. We can support with intelligence and logistics, but better we have French forces, boots on the ground, than U.S. force, boots on the ground.
Are we fighting as effectively and as aggressively against terrorism, and that can be Islamic State, it can be Al-Qaeda, you name it, as we were in past years?
Well, actually, I think one of the great success stories is what's happened inside of Iraq. Iraq, with the military assistance provided by the United States, the intelligence, the airstrikes, the advisors, this has been a country that America's invested in, and it's the country that has defeated, and the only country that's defeated ISIS inside their territory. I think we ought to look at the model that we set inside of Iraq. We ought to take that model where appropriate and use it elsewhere, particularly places such as Afghanistan, and use partner forces, willing partner forces, to do the work rather than American soldiers. Again, we can provide logistics, we can provide intelligence, we can provide advice, we can provide transportation, but we don't always have to lead with American boots on the ground.
Mark, thanks so much for being here. That's retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, and I'm pleased to say we're going to continue talking with him about Iraq specifically. He just raised it. That's coming up in our second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Tomorrow, Saturday, the college football playoffs kick off, so to speak, with the LSU Tigers going up against the Oklahoma Sooners at the Peach Bowl, while the defending national champion Clemson team faces Ohio State in the Fiesta Bowl. The winners will compete for the NCAA National Championship, involving hundreds of millions of dollars in TV rights and merchandising and tickets. But even though Clemson has in many ways the best record over the longest time, it's far from being in the money the way that its rivals are. Joining us now with the story is Novi Williams, who covers the business and sports for Bloomberg News on both radio and on his podcast. Welcome, Evan.
Thanks for having me.
So this is a great piece that you have in the Bloomberg. I was shocked.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised. You know, over the past 5 years, Clemson has been one of, if not the best football team in the country. But their revenue, or their profit rather, for football kind of drags behind a lot of these blue blood programs. And I think you're seeing it for a number of reasons. One, they pay their coach more than anybody else, right? So that's a line item that is pretty expensive. And the other big one, they play in the ACC, right, which just doesn't pay all of its schools as much money for media contracts as the SEC does or the Big Ten does.
Well, does the ACC collectively not get as much in television revenue, or do they get as much but they just don't distribute it back to the schools?
They don't get as much, you know, so it's almost a direct relationship, how much money the conference gets versus how much they pay out to their schools, right? ACC schools like Clemson get $29 million a year as their media cut, each of those schools. Big Ten pays its schools $50 million. the SEC next year, when its new deal kicks in, is going to be even higher than that. So automatically, all these schools in the ACC are starting kind of behind the 8 ball from a revenue standpoint.
But even the numbers you just gave me were roughly about a $20 million disparity.
Yeah.
There's a much bigger disparity how much money they make, Clemson
Absolutely.
versus the other teams that are in the playoffs.
Yeah, so when you look at the other line items, ticket sales, for example, Ohio State makes twice as much from football ticket sales as Clemson does. Of the 4 teams in the playoff, Clemson is by far the lowest in terms of money they get from ticket
Bigger
sales.
stadium or sell it out more?
It's probably a mix of both, right? It's not just the size of the stadium, remember. It's also how much in demand they are, right?
Sure.
A lot of these schools, Ohio State included, will demand a donation just to get your season tickets, right? Depending on how big the demand is there, that's how much that price is, right? So it just depends on how much demand there is for filling that stadium.
And does Clemson have the big luxury suites that now they put into my home school of Michigan? I was offended, but that's fine. But they're making money off it.
Yeah, so every school is working on that. I don't know exactly where Clemson is, but you can bet that there are premium seats in Clemson. And if the team continues to be this good, you're going to see that gap narrow, I think, fairly quickly.
It's a fascinating story that we'll all keep in mind as we watch the playoff championships this weekend. The beginnings of the semifinals. And thanks to Bloomberg's Novi Williams for joining us today. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio in our second hour. We're going to have more with retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. We're going to be talking about Iraq and also Afghanistan. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.